Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to Votonomics, where politics and markets collide. This year, voters around the world have the ability to affect markets, countries, and economies like never before. So we've created this series to help you make sense of it all. I'm Allegra Stratton.
I'm Adrian Wooldridge.
And I'm Stephanie Flanders.
Right, here it is. We've finally got...
We're actually all three in the same place.
A, we're all together, and B, what a momentous week to be all together. It's the week of the UK election. In this episode, we're looking beyond polling day, if you can believe that, to the administration's first 100 days, and we'll be asking, what can the next government really do, given the economy it's inheriting, and can it create the necessary conditions for investors and firms to thrive in the UK? So to help us explore those questions, Stephanie, you spoke to Douglas Flint, Chairman and Asset Manager Abrdn.
I thought Sir Douglas would be an interesting voice to have from the business community and particularly from financial services, one of Britain's most important service sector industries. And he's had very senior positions at HSBC and KPMG, as well as being on the advisory panel for Labour's Financial Services Review. He's sort of a thoughtful observer as well as a serious player in that world. And I was particularly interested with the support he offered, not just to Labour's focus on growth, which of course most people in the business community want them to focus on growth, but the potential need to raise taxes or borrow more to support that agenda. He was remarkably open to that.
OK, well, we're going to look at that in a bit more detail in a second. We do also have in the studio with us Phil Aldrick, who is going to help us unpick what we can expect out of the first 100 days. But first of all, Adrian, your column today is fairly punchy on the possible new Labour government.
My worry is that we are about to elect a Labour government with all the power that entails, because we have a very centralised system with no real checks and balances, and a Prime Minister with a big majority has enormous power, much more so than the American president, in the sense of being no constraint, obvious constraint on that power. And I think we're electing the Labour Party and Starmer to this position without any real scrutiny. This has been an election entirely dominated by the awfulness of the Tories. It's a rejection of the old order, and we haven't really asked difficult questions of the new government. And I think that's the more one looks at it, the more I, at least, am worried. It seems to me, in particular, that the education policy, which consists of removing the 20% VAT exemption on schools, in other words, increasing the price to parents of private education by 20%, is symptomatic, first of all, of a bias towards the state sector, public sector producer lobbies, the teacher unions in particular, and secondly, a hostility towards excellence, independent traditions. And I think this bad Labour runs through all sorts of their policies.
That's a phrase.
I think the pushback would be, and it came partly from your old employer. We saw The Economist endorse Labour this week. And of course, a big chunk of that was as a sort of vote against the Conservative Party, which we've seen obviously in a lot of the endorsements that Labour has had. But I think that The Economist leader did also take the time to make a positive case for Keir Starmer in particular and what he'd done to the Labour Party. So I think the response to you would be, you draw a negative comparison with Tony Blair as being more about change and about bringing in a multiplicity of providers for education and health. I mean, the argument against that would be actually he has changed. He inherited a very unreconstructed Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour Party, has brought it back to the Blairite centre, and will have now a mandate to make some quite difficult changes in public services, which would actually be much harder and more divisive for a Conservative Party to do. We tend to make the classic sort of Nixon to China argument that it's easier for Labour to do that than the Conservatives. I just wonder why you don't think, looking at his record, that he wouldn't be quite ruthless on that.
I'd love to be able to agree with you about that. But if you look at the Labour's education policy, that policy was created under Jeremy Corbyn by Angela Rayner. I remember going to Labour Party conferences in which the teacher unions were cheering that to the rafters, making private schools harder. It's a drop in the
ocean, though, isn't it? I mean, this would be the argument, right? That's actually a bit of red meat, which will not move the dial.
You were saying they don't need to be giving red meat to these dogs because they've been tamed.
But does
So
he believe it, Adrian?
egalitarianism-
This is the fundamental point.
I think he does
that they
believe it.
Yeah.
I think Starmer believes it because
you've
this
seen
is
in
a
the
party.
last week they've all come out with quite full-throated support for
Absolutely, this is a party rooted in the public sector with very, very public sector producerist passions. His instincts are pro-public sector at a time when we really need to improve the productivity of the public sector. And he has this idea of industrial policy, if you want to call it industrial policy, whatever it is, state activism, state intervention in the economy. And Britain has a dismal record at that. And the Labour Party seems to be saying, look, Britain is broken, the state is broken, let's spend more money on it and give it more responsibilities.
Stephanie, anything else you want to disagree with Adrian about?
No, I think it's going to be exhilarating, this new government. People say it's going to be terribly boring and they're not doing anything, but if for nothing else, but we can continue to have this very lively debate.
Patiently listening to all of this has been one of Bloomberg's most brilliant reporters, Phil Aldrick. Award-winning Phil Aldrick. Phil, just to go quickly to it, first 100 days, what do you think will be most interesting if it's a Labour government?
Well, they're going to have to get through these key bills. So the workers' rights, that's going to be a big development. And then the planning reforms, which, that's the most exciting thing. If they could actually come up with something which does transform the UK's performance. We'll probably have the budget in early September or mid-September. If they don't hold it before the party conferences, it's not going to come till sort of late October. And then there's this big question of whether we have a single year spending review, just a sort of rollover year, so that they can really build some proper plans. They say they're going to drive or pay for everything by getting growth. So will there be an increase in growth prospects in that intervening year? And then you don't have to raise taxes quite as much to afford what are going to have to be big spending increases.
But Phil, you are an expert on all these matters. Is it possible for them to be demonstrating, Keir Starmer said the other day he needs 2.5% growth, which is more than America's enjoying right now. Is it possible for him to be demonstrating signs or indications that they're getting 2.5% growth in the next 12 months?
Yeah, I mean, that is
a stretch target.
It is.
Yeah.
This is the thing. If Liz Truss, as she did, say that I'm going to deliver you 2.5% growth and it's going to pay for everything, then everyone's going to say what a load of nonsense and throw the sterling out with the bathwater, and that is not going to happen under Keir Starmer because they know that lesson and they're not going to basically predicate their entire policy on a 2.5% growth schedule. They are going to be raising taxes or increasing borrowing, and so there are you can change the fiscal rules. I think it's very unlikely for them to do that immediately after winning the election because they've come in on a manifesto with a set of very tight fiscal rules, so they won't be able to release
even borrowing to invest. You don't think they'll do that?
Well, they're limited to the exact same degree because it's the debt rule that's binding rather than...
We should just summarise quickly what so there's the borrowing to invest, which is just how much making sure that what you borrow every year is no more than what you're using for investment. So you can't be using it to, for example, fast rising bit of the bill, debt interest, paying interest on the debt. How much are you borrowing year to year? And then there's the stock rule. It's like, how much is your total debt going up and is it stabilising? And this rather odd rule that says in 5 years' time, you have to be able to show that the debt stock is going to fall relative to your economy. It doesn't matter what it's doing in the 4 years before that, as long as
the fifth year it's coming down.
And at the moment, they are very, very close to that because Jeremy Hunt has not given much room for manoeuvre.
Exactly. There was £8.9 billion headroom in the last budget, and so they don't have any money to spend there, and they're bound by that same figure. So they're either going to have to get better growth, and so it won't go to 2.5%, but it maybe the growth projection for the country will be a bit better, and that will generate a little bit of extra income. But inevitably, there are. I think everybody assumes there's going to be some tax rises,
and tax rises to prevent a tough squeeze on public spending.
Yeah,
this
exactly.
is the sort of vice. That's
so
been discussed.
They've got so you've got to settle these junior doctors' strikes. There's other pay deals. So the pay review bodies have delivered their what they want this year to the departments, but no one has seen these yet because obviously we're having the election instead.
And the junior doctors are wanting 35%.
Exactly. So they're never going to get that, but there could be a big extra bill to pay for the public sector workers, and there is the prisons are in absolute chaos, so you can see that there's going to be immediate demands. So it seems likely that there will be some additional tax policy if it is a September budget, just to get over that bump, or they could sort of fiddle the figures and do some kind of just try and take on a little bit of extra borrowing. But I think, subsequently we're going to see some broader tax rises next year.
I mean, you spent a lot of time talking to the Treasury and the Bank of England. Do you get the sense that they're expecting quite a big first budget from Rachel Reeves, despite the very limited promises in the manifesto? Or is it a question of, we're going to build credibility? Do they think they've got time to build credibility, or do they really need to do something quite dramatic on growth?
I thought originally that they were going to do a big first budget because, you can hit the ground running. But all the noise I'm hearing is that it's going to be, it's not going to be a huge first budget, and that, they're going to it's going to be next year that you're going to see, if necessary, these big tax rises. And because obviously the big issue is what you do with spending, and how you fix spending. And they haven't really got time to do a proper spending review because the depth of investigation that's needed to do at the departmental level to really come up with proper plans.
So how do you get around that? Because they need new plans for April.
Yeah, so they'll do a 1 year. So they'll have the spending plans for a single year, and then they build out the bigger, broader plans for 3 to 5 years beyond that next year. So that's one thing. That's one thing that I'm increasingly hearing from around in the policy circles.
Quick question. When you say next year, do you mean a spring budget or
an autumn budget next year? Autumn budget and spending review. So
like every chancellor, she said she's only going to have one big fiscal event, but they never do.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. We'll see.
I do think it's not an open-ended book for them. They've got to crack on pretty quickly in order to. We all say landslide going to be huge. 2-3 term prime minister, but we did say that about Boris at one point. It did look, and not long after 2019, that administration could go on and on and on. And part of their problem was, how do you deliver on levelling up within 4 to 5 years? It was always going to be tough, and potentially the answer is they didn't. But the same challenge is going to be the case for Starmer. How does he deliver for these people he has persuaded he is different?
Yeah, well, that's going to be the big question, isn't it? I do think it's going to come down to planning and to sort of, do you bring HS2 back, that second leg of HS2, as well as doing the northern. And it's those kind of big infrastructure projects where you can demonstrate that you're doing something for these regions, even if it doesn't get completed in time, but actually, things are underway. And this general building project.
The psephologists say that he's likely to get this big victory on a pretty small proportion of the vote. We also have a very unstable electorate. For example, all those red wall voters who will go back are not going to be permanent.
No, because what they've done is they've demonstrated they're promiscuous.
Promiscuous is a very good word, the right word. But I do think there's a big difference between Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson. That Boris Johnson was a flibberty-jib, and Keir Starmer is clearly not a flibberty-jib. He's clearly somebody who is interested in achieving results and has studied the mechanisms of power. So he will do more. Whether he does enough, that's a different question, but he's a serious person, which Boris never was.
The point that you've come back to, just to come back to where we started, if he does something that genuinely looks like it's going to move the dial on planning and other things that are proven obstacles to raising living standards through higher productivity, it is possible that the Office for Budget Responsibility, which is marking his homework on this and actually, in a sense, setting how much leeway he has by making their growth forecasts, they could give him some credit in advance. So, yes, actually, we do think that, and they did that. There's a record of them doing that with Jeremy Hunt when he cut national insurance in a way that they thought would increase the workforce. So that will be one of the things he can play with, which actually he doesn't have to deliver. He just has to convince the OBR that growth will get up. And that's through those kinds of public investments. But also something that came up with Douglas Flint, sort of softer investments, potentially, in skills and other things.
Yeah, and also just the foreign direct investment, talking about France earlier, the UK is looking more attractive, in relative terms. So we've been doing pretty well on the FDI, so perhaps we do get some of this investment boom that we've been waiting, feels like, generations for.
And at Bloomberg, you will be very well placed to be the first to spot that money coming in.
Yes, exactly. The data will be there.
All right, that's a good place to leave it for now, Phil, but come back when we have this possible Labour government.
as we discussed at the beginning, I had this nice chat with Douglas Flint. We talked a bit about his past. He's now chairman of the asset manager Abrdn. And I started by asking him, after all the upheaval we've had under successive Conservative governments and prime ministers, whether this might be one time where changing the party in power might be seen by the business world as a vote for stability.
I certainly think it's the way the business world is hoping that it plays out, because I think we've had a period of instability, uncertainty, and business plans in much longer cycles than political cycles. To have the ability to plan because there's a government with a sufficient majority that it can actually command support of the House of Commons to get legislation through, to give clarity on what its plans are in important areas of the economy like infrastructure, like pension provision, retirement provision, and so on. I think the hope is that we enter a period of stability where there is clarity as to what the policy framework will be. Some people may not like that framework, but it's much better to operate within a framework of certainty rather than a framework of instability and lack of certainty.
Sir Keir Starmer has made much of the changes he's made to the Labour Party since Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, and others have made quite a lot of effort to reach out to business, to hold breakfasts and lunches with people in the city and elsewhere. Is there a basic level of trust for Labour among the business community?
I think there's been a real sense of gratitude that there has been that reach out, and particularly because that reach out has been, you need to help us to understand what we need to do or what the reaction will be if we do something different from what you're expecting, and so on and so forth. So I think there's been a level of reach out which has been help us to understand your sector, whether it's in energy or transportation or financial services. And that's encouraging, because I think the relationship between business and government has gone up and down over the last, 15, 20 years or whatever. And I think business would like to feel that it has a role to play. And it's good that there is engagement with business today and a willingness to listen. Now, how that gets translated is where the rubber hits the road.
As an economist, it's been an ongoing topic, this sort of lack of productivity growth in the UK, which is, of course, the only way you really raise living standards, making more stuff with the same number of people. And there's been a sort of dynamic around this where economists and others have pointed to the sort of micro underlying reasons holding back growth, planning, lack of skills, these kind of broader aspects of the environment, macroeconomic stability. And then what successive governments have done when in the name of helping business has been cutting corporation tax and focusing on taxes and not on those micro things that are quite difficult. Do you think there's an appetite for the reverse of that under a new government in return for addressing some of those difficult things, making people build more houses, pushing through more big infrastructure programs? The business community might be open to some increased taxes, because it looks like there's not going to be many increases in personal taxation given how many things Rachel Reeves has ruled out. If
you ask any business or any individual, would you like higher taxes? The answer is pretty obvious.
It's a trade-off.
No.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if you say, if we can build an economy where there is growth and your business will prosper and your family income will do well, are you prepared to invest into that growth in the economy, growth in the family income? Are you happy to invest in a society where you can visibly see that the infrastructure you operate within and the services you enjoy are better? I think people will respond to that. But of course, that is the trade-off.
I know you've been part of the advisory panel for Labour's Financial Services Review. What advice are you giving them? Would you give them now? What should they be looking out for and bear traps to avoid when it comes to financial sector in particular?
Well, I was one of 10 that were asked to basically review the document they produced on policy for the financial services industry, and a policy framework that starts off with, we will unashamedly champion the financial services industry of the UK as one of our core strategic assets. It's a pretty good opening statement. And the kind of the exam question was, is there anything in this that you think is silly, won't work? Is there anything you think's missing? Is there anything you think will attract particular comment from media or other commentators, and the vast majority of what was in it was straightforward. I mean, the political stuff wasn't in it because that's a political choice and wasn't in the policy framework. But to start off with a framework that you believe that you have a financial services sector that is extraordinarily full of skills that you need to grow the economy, and you want to harness those skills and control them in an appropriate way without overreach, is a very good start for engagement with the sector. I mean, I think the financial sector has always kind of believed, tell us what you want us to do and we'll help you achieve it. And I hope that is the dialogue with whichever government we end up in a week's time.
Are Labour underestimating the costs of clamping down even more comprehensively on the non-dom status? It's the kind of thing one hears a lot in the city of people planning to leave because Labour is proposing something that's actually a bit tougher than what the Chancellor introduced earlier this year.
Look, it's a political choice. I'm not going to comment on the relative.
But do you know people who are talking about leaving
I know people
as a result?
Are talking about it, but I think that in the context of the scale of the economy, I think it's a factor, but not a huge factor. I also think that there are many other factors that attract people to the UK than just the rate of tax that they pay. I mean, security, the lifestyle, the arts, the culture, the connectivity to other parts of the world, the rule of law. All of these things are factors. There may well be people for whom that tax change, as it's implemented, will impact the way that they live their life. But, in terms of the shape of the economy as a whole, I don't think that's one of the biggest issues.
Some of the people who've been talking about moving to France are now rethinking as a result of the turbulence there, and possibly we've had one round, but a quite dramatic result of the second round of French elections. Are you hearing that actually suddenly some parts of Europe actually also are looking a bit unstable, uncertain?
Well, I think that what's happening in France at the moment reminds people that things can happen that are unpredictable. Nobody saw that coming. People talked about UK election, the US election, and all of a sudden we've got an election we didn't expect in France with potentially quite dramatic consequences depending on how you play it through. And that could have an impact on Europe. And again, I think in terms of the narrower conversation around the City of London, instability elsewhere is actually quite good for the City of London in terms of it attracts business, it attracts talent, it attracts people. It kind of highlights the resilient stability of the City of London and our legal system.
For an international business in any sector, what's the framework to plan against in a world where Donald Trump is elected in November?
I think one of his characteristics is he's unpredictable, and yet when he was in power, some of the fears that people had didn't materialize. Some did. So I guess it would be a foolish person who said they know exactly what he's going to do. He's obviously still got to get elected, and there's no certainty over that. There's a long way to go, but I think people will reflect thoughtfully on either of the two candidates as to what role will America play in the world, whether it's a security role, whether it's an economic role, whether it's a role that seeks to attract more and more economic value into the United States, or whether it wants to share its economic power with others to create, friends. And I personally don't think that the major issues that face the world in terms of biodiversity, climate, demographics, migration, an aging population within demographics can be solved without nations working together. So you can't have one winner and everyone else living a terrible existence. And, Europe, America, Asia led by China, the Middle East are all fundamental actors in this. So I would hope that whoever is the President of the United States reflects on the contribution they can make through leadership to the rest of the world.
I've heard a number of senior investors, privately at least, and certainly some business leaders across Europe, including the UK, say if Donald Trump is elected, especially given the kind of spending he wants to do and the tax cuts, but also the way he does tend to see the world in a sort of zero-sum American first way, if he gets elected, I'm going to do everything I can to be attached to the US because that's where all the money's going to be, and money's going to be sucked out of everywhere else.
I've heard people say that. I don't think that's a good answer, because I think that we need to build societies in the rest of the world that have resilience for our children, grandchildren, and we don't do that if we concentrate all economic power in any one part of the world. And I actually don't think that will happen, because in a kind of a way, I think governments would react to business if business said we're only going to bet on one team, one flavor of success. Because at the end of the day, governments are elected by people who've got jobs, and if you organize your economy so that the jobs are all somewhere else, there are many more people who are not going to be supportive of the policies that have led that to happen. I also think, talking to American business, they recognize that if they want to have the export markets they want, they can't capture everything for themselves, but still expect people to buy their goods and services. I don't believe the worst extrapolation of what could be done by any political personality will come to pass, because I don't think they would work.
Going back to the UK, assuming we do have a new government, a Labour government, if we have our first woman chancellor, lots of ifs, but the polls are certainly pushing that way. In 1997, there was that big first surprise move that Gordon Brown did of making the Bank of England independent, which was not only a sort of shock and awe moment, but actually also sent a very powerful signal about macroeconomic stability and tying one's hands. And I think reassured maybe the business community after many years of Conservative rule. Would you have any advice for Rachel Reeves about, in her first budget, what would be a powerful signal about their seriousness to achieve growth and to do what they've said they're going to do on the campaign, which is put growth really before anything else?
I think one of the important things for whichever government we have is to think very carefully about how we unlock the savings of the nation. I mean, one of the things that I think we'll look back and reflect on whether it went the way that we wanted it to. But when we sort of closed defined benefit pension schemes 30 years ago, and replace them with defined contribution arrangements, because they're not
defined benefits being sort of final salary
schemes, corporate schemes, and replace them with contribution schemes, which are not pension schemes, because there's no annuity at the end of it. The contribution rates are probably a half to a third of what they would be if we were still running defined benefit schemes. So the pool of money going into savings for all the things that people save for is significantly less, and effectively the city runs on the flow of money, and the flow of money coming in from retirement systems is considerably less than it used to be. The evolution of people investing against their own risk preferences tends to be that people have a much more modest risk appetite than they would have vicariously if someone was doing it for them, because they can take in pooled savings much more, a broader view of where they might put their money. And we're in a world now where, for all very good reasons, the vast amount of money that goes into equities goes into global equities, of which, depending on who does the construction, 60 to 80% goes into US equities because it's market cap weighted.
And quite a big portion of that's been going into Nvidia. A handful of stocks. And because one of the things you would also want to do as an incoming government is say, we've got to spend more money on infrastructure. If we're going to get productivity, we have to do things with infrastructure. That means the planning system in large part, but we've got to do something to get infrastructure, all the grid, electricity supply, transportation, all that stuff. How are you going to fund it? If you can't tax more and you can't borrow more, then you've got to channel the population savings into pools of assets that offer an attractive return and also offer a sort of a benefit to those who are investing in it, saying, I'm doing something for the future of my kids and my grandkids because we're going to build a better society. So I would think very much about infrastructure. I think very much about pensions. And I'm not an economist. I know you're an absolutely fabulous one. But I also think that, if you take the analogy of business, we absolutely distinguish between borrowing for investment and borrowing for consumption. And we have these rules about the total borrowing has to come down over the life of a parliament. It depends what the borrowing's for. If we are borrowing to invest and genuinely invest in infrastructure and including soft infrastructure,
And we have the capability as in government to ensure that the return on that investment, because we control the pricing of it, is adequate. Then we should be investing in physical and soft assets, infrastructure for the future, without getting caught up with the fact that because our consumption expenditure is rising because of a slow economy or whatever, we can't invest in the long-term growth of the economy. I think that, I know it's been a huge debate for a very long period of time, but I would at least think about that, whether we can find a way of saying this is genuinely capital expenditure, and that's okay.
Well, that's it. You've said two interesting things there, and as well as being terribly nice about me. But so obviously I like that bit. But I do think you've said, or you've given the impression, I know you're not speaking, it'd be so easy if you spoke for the whole of the global or the UK financial community and business sector, and you don't. But for the purposes of this podcast, it is interesting that you've said, actually, if it was genuinely for investment, there could be an appetite and an acceptance of more borrowing. But also, you talked about soft infrastructure, suggesting that one could also have a broader definition of the kind of infrastructure we're talking about. It doesn't have to be big hospitals or roads and the things that we tend to think of. I have the sense if the next government announced they were actually going to change their rules, they've said they won't, but they changed the book debt rule in order to be able to borrow more over the next 5 or 6 years, and they were going to broaden the definition of investment, they would be jumped on for trying to get away with fudging the figures, and we're going back to silly money and borrowing too much. But you think possibly they could make the case?
Well, I think you would need to demonstrate that you were genuinely putting it into skills training and education. You were genuinely putting it into the hard infrastructure. But
that means teachers' salaries. I mean, if you're putting it into skills, that's going to then say, well, no, you're just paying teachers' salaries.
But if you believed, and if you could demonstrate that by having more and better teachers, you would have a better workforce, more capable of earning their living and therefore not being dependent on welfare. If you had more people in employment, then you wouldn't have the need for immigration so much. If you had more people in employment, then your health statistics and your crime statistics should be better. So you can make the case. Now, yes, the cynics would jump on it, but it ought to be possible to make the case. And then the question would be, can you actually back up what you've said with what you're doing and show the evidence? You know, genuinely, skills training is a fundamental underpin of the economy, and we should be investing in it. And, you know, as individuals, we've invested in our own education. So what more important is there for future generations than to invest in them?
Douglas Flint, I wonder how many others are thinking that way across the business community, let alone within the new Labour government, if we get one. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
So I don't know what you guys thought of that. You know, he was being very careful not to be partisan, but I was interested in not just the air of general positivity, but also this sense, at least from him, that financial services and perhaps the business community generally would be relatively relaxed about the idea of higher taxes, even on businesses at the margin, or higher borrowing, if there was a real sense that the new government could show where the money was going to be invested.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, the idea that France is making us more and more attractive, which we
I quite like that. It was just so kind of boldly. You're supposed to not want, insecurity on your border, and he was like, no, actually, quite good for the city.
And then, as you've also alluded to, the idea that potentially investing in skills, and I think you guys talked a lot about teachers' salaries, and whether that would be a benign thing for the state to get involved in, because ultimately would improve education and then people's earning abilities.
Well, let me first say that I think the most important word in all of this is stability. And if you can offer stability, you're offering business a good chunk of what it wants. What the Tories did was to offer instability and imbecility, and the combination of the two wasn't all that attractive. So that is much. Taxes matter, but they don't matter anything like as much as that. What worries me about a general increase in teachers' pay, I'm not sure is a very good thing. You need incentives, you need differentials, you need a competitive environment for the teaching profession. So
I think it was more about you might be investing. If you were investing in skills, ultimately that would come down to teachers' salaries, not necessarily raising their salaries, but you'd be spending more money on teachers and calling it investment.
But it does bring us back to where we started this podcast, which is on VAT being removed from private school fees in the following way, which is, again, whether the Starmer government is setting itself up for tricky times, because they're saying they're doing this so they can fund more teachers, but the number of teachers they will fund will be 1 teacher per 3 schools. So again, you're kind of state schools, sorry. So I mean, you get the kind of principle behind it and the philosophy of wanting to bring more maths teachers, for instance, is the example he uses all the time, into state schools. Clearly that is a noble aim, but whether or not he's actually going to be able to do it in any
Allegra, the fact that a government, anybody who was either in government or about to be in government would make numbers sound bigger than they really are and try and impress people with the number of. I mean, I'm just shocked to hear.
But if you look,
you should put it on the side of a bus.
Well, there you go.
If you look at Sweden or Denmark, for example, they actually give state subsidies to people to go to private schools, partly because by going to private schools they're taking their custom out of the country. We have a hang-up. It's a class-based hang-up, and it presumes that everybody's going to Eton or Harrow.
This hang-up doesn't seem to have held back the private education sector in the UK.
20% increase of cost.
You know how much it's gone up way more than that past inflation over the last 10 years. So I just think I don't look at the public schools
back a little bit and say that
really
the public
having
schools,
a tough time.
The public schools have behaved disgracefully. They've brought it upon themselves. They've been irresponsible, short-termist, greedy. That they deserve to some extent to be punished, but I do sympathise with the parents who are going to be clobbered by. this.
One thing I do think is interesting is do you think, Adrian, and I totally accept that it all, if other things equal, if you had the choice, you probably wouldn't particularly want to have a higher rate of tax on education, and it's not what happens across the continent. But today, if it wasn't exempt from VAT, would we exempt it? Would any government, including a Conservative government, choose to have it not be subject to a tax that you pay when you buy a kettle, when you buy a fridge, when you buy an oven? All these very basic things you pay VAT on.
Do you pay when you buy an opera ticket VAT on it? I mean, there are certain cultural goods that I think don't carry VAT. No, but what worries me more than the private-public divide is the attitude that it embodies. Because when Blair came into power, he had this idea that in order to improve productivity in the educational sector, you had to have league tables, you had to have academy schools or schools that could have more independence, you had to have more differentiation. Starmer seems to have the opposite attitude, which is you just need to spend public sector producers, give them more money, and also close down or make competition more difficult. That's the wrong attitude.
Totally going to be able to see in the data a massive change in the quality of UK education as a result of this one change in VAT.
No. As I was saying, it's symbolic. It's symbolic of an attitude. When Blair came in, he wanted to shake up the public sector and make it more meritocratic. When Starmer comes in next week, his first line of duty will be to remove competitive pressure from the system. That's not right. That's not good. He needs an Adonis figure to come in and say, let's try and turn this country into a meritocracy.
I think it's going to be fascinating to see how he governs. And you are right that we don't have a good enough idea.
But in a week's time, we will know exactly what form the next government's taking. Thanks for listening to this week's Votonomics from Bloomberg. This episode was hosted by me, Allegra Stratton, with Stephanie Flanders and Adrian Wooldridge. It was produced by Summer Sardi with booking support from Chris Martlew, production support and sound design by Moses Andam. Brendan Francis Newnham is our executive producer and Sage Bauman is head of podcasts. Special thanks to Phil Aldrick and Douglas Flint. Please subscribe, rate and review wherever you listen to podcasts.